Hello, friends. Very soothing greetings of this beautiful evening to all of you. Today, I, Kunal Nagpal, am feeling immensely pleased to welcome you back to this great economic forum. Dear guys, in today's session, we are basically going to analyze in detail the core aspects of the Indian economy and its immense role in today's globalization. Actually, honestly speaking, today's era is not of commercial globalization. Yes, mind my words, it's not an era of commercial globalization. It's an era of human centered globalization. And that's what our leaders are preaching. And that's what they are practicing. And that's why our country is getting highlighted worldwide for its extraordinary success because our baseline, our basic foundation on which we are operating in this international arena in the current times is actually totally based on humanitarianism and the compassionate behavior. This is the principle underlying our strategic international relationships with various economies across the globe. That is, developing a unified approach, a sense of unionism, a sense of global familyhood. And that's why we are developing a very strong vision to turn into the $10 trillion economy very soon. And in all walks, we are actually excelling. So dear friends, I would like to begin today's session with an overview of the extreme significance of the digital economy, which is actually offering the hopes for multiple players across the economy. So the push towards the digital economy is of vital importance. So we are going to go through this particular aspect in detail. India's push towards expanding the digital economy offers room for multiple players to actually grow in the payments ecosystem, said Mr. Michael Froman, Vice Chairman and President, Strategic Growth at MasterCard. So, digitization and expanding the digital economy is actually very good. There is plenty of room for many different types of players in that ecosystem. Mr. Froman, who is a former United States G20 Sherpa and in the country to attend the B20 inception meeting here, told Economic Times. He was actually responding to a query on whether RuPay and Unified Payments Interface, that is UPI, were a competition to the MasterCard in the country. There can be multiple ways for the people to participate in the digital payments. What's important is as that the system continues to evolve, the issues around cybersecurity and fraud become very important, he added. He said the MasterCard sees India as one of its key markets. We have basically invested significantly in India, and we see it as one of the most exciting markets in the world precisely for the government's commitment to the basic aspect of digitalization. He said, adding that MasterCard had offered India its cybersecurity improvement service as the country ramps up its efforts to increase the digitization of transactions. He said MasterCard was 100% compliant with data localization norms. all our data is actually on soil. Irrespective of what future policies are, all Indian data is actually processed in India and stored in India. Mr. Froman said MasterCard was also working with India's CERT through capacity building in order to improve cybersecurity for the payments in the country. We have actually brought cyber experts from many parts of the world to India to actually help train people on the latest developments in the cybersecurity domain, he said. So, with this particular overview, we analyze that digitalization is actually the key to development, and it is the basic means for sustenance of the economies. Because the current times actually demand for this. That is the digitalization of the entire economy. And if we analyze this from the perspective of SWOT analysis, this is a great opportunity being presented by the external environment. So, a successful leader is one who is able to make the best possible use and is able to take the best possible advantage of this particular opportunity by actually exploiting this opportunity at the best capacity. So, moving ahead, let's analyze in a very broad manner the basic aspect of globalization. All of us are very well versed with the term globalization, and it's a very vital aspect for an open economy. But as we are observing in current scenario, that is commerce without morality, is this appropriate? No, definitely no. Anything without the moral standards is not done. And therefore, morality should form the basis of any kind of function across the society. So, we are basically going to consider globalization with the direct correlation with Gandhiji's 7 sins. So the title of our current discussion is Globalization and Gandhiji's 7 sins. Dear friends, the basic reason or the basic objective for discussing this particular aspect is that in today's era of the current times of rising sensitivity across the globe, we actually need to pay a lot of emphasis towards incorporating the etiquettes, the basic moral standards, the basic ethical standards in each and every activity. And since globalization is actually a very, very important aspect to form the bilateral ties and to work as an open economy, we need to work in sync with each other through the mode of import and export. We need to actually implement the ethical standards at the best possible level. So we are going to analyze this particular aspect with regard to commerce without morality. So let's begin. If inequality arising out of the unqualified pushing down of costs for the capital represents commerce without morality, the politicians who have enabled a taxation system that actually facilitates this represent politics without principle. This is a very, very deep statement. Hence, I would like to highlight it once again. If the inequality arising out of the unqualified pushing down of costs for capital represents commerce without morality, the politicians who have enabled the taxation system that facilitates this actually represents politics without principle. And also we know there is no shortcut to success. Similarly, there is no short way, no shortcut to get your work done, be it any type of work. And if you're adopting the shortcut through unethical means, you are obviously unsuccessful. No one can call you successful. So, globalization is actually a very grand word that has been used to cover up its true nature, which has always been about reducing the costs for the companies in the developed markets. And actually, to be sure, reducing costs or increasing efficiency is generally a very worthy goal, except when in planning and practice it is marred by one of Gandhiji's 7 social sins, that is, commerce without morality. There is actually no gainsaying that globalization has improved the economic lot, often substantially, of millions of people in poorer countries, but it has also led to a stupefying increase in inequality in both developing and developed countries. I repeat, there is actually no gainsaying that globalization has actually improved the economic lot, often substantially, of millions of people in the poorer countries. But it has also led to a stupefying increase in inequality in both developing and developed countries. And while this may not have really mattered on the balance thus far in the poorer countries, because, as they say, a rising tide lifts all the boats, it has come back to bite the rich world viciously. For instance, the horrifying increase in inequality in the United States of America has actually resulted in San Francisco being reduced to a pre-third world city, which is actually worse in some ways than the Mumbai some of us have grown up, with the human excrement fouling many parts of the city that was for decades touted as one of the loveliest and most livable cities in the world. And San Francisco is actually not alone. Toronto, that used to be a quiet urban backwater a few decades ago, suffers similar street life in certain areas. Now, being a good Gujarati, Gandhiji understood that commerce is actually necessary to grease the wheels of economic progress. And being a far-sighted human being, he also understood that the natural instinct of commerce actually needs to be flavored with morality to make it truly sustainable and sensible. So, this flavor can actually be added in many ways, from Henry Ford ensuring that his workers earned enough to afford his cars to, in a more structural sense, a tax code that is specifically focused on ensuring that inequality does not climb beyond a certain point. I repeat, the flavor of morality can basically be added in many ways, from Henry Ford ensuring that his workers earned enough to afford his cars, in a more structural sense, a tax code that is specifically focused on ensuring that inequality does not climb beyond a certain point. Also, it can be noted that in the 1980s, the capital gains rate in the United States of America was 80%. Today, it is only 15%. One of the sure signs that this has been much too low for too long is the obvious fact that there is too much capital in the world. The asset prices have risen and risen and risen, and finally, inflation has taken off. Again, till a year or so ago, there was so much capital sloshing around that the professional investors were compelled to invest trillions of dollars at the negative interest rates. While the US Fed has finally pushed the interest rates higher, the real interest rates, that is, the interest rates minus inflation, which affect the real people, remain negative. Now, we are in this pickle because the tax code, certainly in the USA, is written by the politicians who enjoy one more of Gandhiji's 7 sins, that is, politics without principle. The highest bidders are the corporate sector, HNIs and their relatives call the shots. So the tax code is actually structured to ensure that the rich get richer and the wealthy become super wealthy. So this galloping inequality actually needs some kind of circuit breaker in the tax code, rather like the debt ceiling, in order to resolve, which of course needs a return to some kind of politics with principle. That is, the incorporation of the moral standards is of paramount importance. So as a result of all this, we are now in a world where these failures are actually leading to a huge amount of instability in the financial markets, with financial crisis occurring more and more frequently. And here, another one of Gandhiji's 7 sins, that is knowledge without character. I repeat, knowledge without character is actually taking the center stage. The financial regulators, supposedly imbued with the most detailed knowledge of markets, have certainly, since the 1980s, have actually failed to show the backbone they needed. Starting with Mr. Alan Greenspan in 1987, the US monetary authorities made investing a tea party by issuing what became known as the Greenspan Pot. The Fed told investors, most already wealthy people, exactly what it was going to do, sometimes almost to the day. This made investing a near zero risk game. Thus, with the Fed, charitably speaking, asleep at the wheel, inequality continued and is even continuing to surge. Equally, the investors have forgotten how to price the risk, as a result of which the financial crises have actually become ever so much more common. 6 of the 8 financial crises in the last 100 years have happened since 1980. This is really alarming. I repeat, 6 of the 8 financial crises in the last 100 years have actually happened since 1980. That is within the span of 42 years. And so it goes. Now, we are basically going to develop a broad understanding of the recent development, that is, the bilateral ties between India and France in the defense sector. That is, we are very strategically going to analyze that how France is ready to help India diversify from Russia by building fighters to the nuclear submarines, asserting that France is a great option for India to diversify its defense supplies amid a heavy dependence on Russia. The French ambassador to New Delhi, Mr. Emmanuel Lenin, said it's actually willing to partner with India on the critical projects, including possible nuclear-powered submarines. On board the French nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, the French envoy also committed to jointly developing a fighter jet engine together. We have actually great cooperation on strategic issues. This is an extreme level of trust for the countries to actually commit to each other, he said, responding to a query by the print. No other country can actually commit to delivering the best technology to the Indian forces without any kind of restrictions. We are actually committed not just to make in India, but also step further and co-develop and co-manufacture with India. He was actually responding to a question on whether France was willing to help India diversify from its dependence on Russia when it comes to defense equipment. India is actually looking to diversify its suppliers, and obviously France is a great option. So, yes, he said. He actually pointed out that France has successfully delivered 36 Rafale fighter jets and other systems to India and actually wants to develop a national level defense industrial base in India. Asked if France will help India in developing the nuclear powered and nuclear attack submarines just like the Russians, he underlined that the country has a long-standing submarine cooperation with India. The naval group has actually been working with the Mazagon Dock Limited and building in India the Scorpion submarines while fully transferring the technology, he said. We actually want to continue with our partnership. Whether India wants to go in for P-75 or more, Scorpions or even next generation, it is up to India to make up its mind. Mr. Lenin pointed out that with Australia, the French had offered a new conventional diesel and electric submarine based on its Barracuda class of nuclear-powered submarine. So it can be done, he said. Now let's analyze the entirely renewed ties between India and France. The French envoy basically said that the level of cooperation that exists between India and France requires trust and commitment for 10 to 30 years. France had always stood by India, he said, even when other countries like the United States of America had slapped sanctions on New Delhi over the nuclear tests. He was actually referring to the nuclear tests that India conducted in Pokhran in the year 1998. The ties between India and France date back several decades. And the last few years have actually seen a renewed push for the deeper bilateral ties, especially in the defense sector. So, the growing relationship between the two countries has actually led to the view from a certain quarters that France has replaced Russia as India's new best friend. Sources in India's defense and security establishment also argue that as New Delhi seeks to move away from its dependence on Russia, it will also keep the interests of Russia which actually has for long been the biggest partner for India in the Indian subcontinent's strategic program in mind. So, according to the 2020 study by the Stimson Center, 85% of the Indian armed forces work with Russian equipment. Now, dear friends, let's analyze another major development in the export domain, in the export import domain of our country. The government basically eases the norms for certain sectors under the Export Promotion Capital Goods Scheme, that is EPCG scheme. So, in a relief to the exporters from hotel, healthcare, and educational sectors, the government on Friday announced a one-time relaxation for them with respect to maintaining the average export obligation under the Export Promotion Capital Goods Scheme. Under this particular scheme, the imports of capital goods are actually allowed duty-free, subject to an export obligation. The latest relaxation will actually be available for hotel, healthcare, and educational sectors, the Commerce Ministry said in a statement. This relaxation has actually been provided in the light of the economic slowdown caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this relief will help the hotel, healthcare, and educational sectors to actually cope with the negative impact of the pandemic on their export activities, the statement said. So for the years 2020-21 and 2021-22, these particular sectors will not be required to maintain the average export obligation for the EPCG authorization issued to them. The government has announced a one-time relaxation from maintaining the average export obligation and an option to extend the export obligation period for certain sectors under the EPCG scheme, it said. So these sectors will also have the option to extend the export obligation period for a longer duration without having to pay any additional fees. And this extension will be granted without the payment of the composition fees. However, for the EPCG authorizations issued for the sectors other than hotel, healthcare, and educational, the export obligation period may be extended for the number of days the existing export obligation period falls within February 1, 2020 and July 31, 2021, it added. So in such cases, the extension will basically be granted without the payment of composition fees, but with a 5% additional export obligation in value terms on the balance export obligation as on March 31, 2022. The scheme basically aims to encourage the production of goods for export by providing import duty concessions on capital goods. It is administered by the Directorate General of Foreign Trade, that is DGFT, and is governed by the Foreign Trade Policy of India. Now, my dear friends, after having developed the broad and strategic framework being built up in India with regard to actually facilitate globalization in a very easy, effective, and ethical manner, benefiting the sectors involved at an immense rate, we would like to move forward in order to discuss that how India is stepping up in the global economy, which actually needs a new powerhouse. Yes, you are getting me right. The global economy needs a new powerhouse, and India is in this particular category. to get qualified for this particular requirement. India's economic transformation is actually kicking into high gear. The global manufacturers are looking beyond China, with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji stepping up to seize the moment. The government is spending nearly 20% of its budget this fiscal year on the capital investments, the most in at least a decade. Shri Narendra Modi ji is actually closer than any predecessor to being able to claim that the nation, which may have just passed China as the world's most populous, is finally meeting its economic potential. To get there, he will have to wrestle with the drawbacks of its exceptional scale, the remnants of the red tape and corruption that has slowed India's rise, and the stark inequality that actually defines the democracy of 1.4 billion people. India is actually on the cusp of huge change, said Mr. Nandan Nilekani, a founder of Infosys Limited, one of the nation's largest technology services companies. India has quickly created a capacity to support tens of thousands of startups, a few billion smartphones, and the data rates that actually rank among the lowest in the world, he said. US-China rivalry, which is the major development happening across the global scenario, is actually providing a tailwind. India and Vietnam will be the big beneficiaries as the companies move toward a China plus one strategy, supply chain analysts say. Apple Inc.'s 3 key Taiwanese suppliers have won the incentives from Modi ji's government to boost the smartphone production and exports. The shipments more than doubled to top $2.5 billion of iPhones from April through December. And as the powerhouses from China to Germany contend with slowing growth, the stakes are actually rising to find another nation equipped to propel the global economy. Mr. Morgan Stanley predicts that India will actually drive a fifth of the world expansion this decade, positioning the nation as one of only 3 that can actually generate more than $400 billion in annual growth output. So the basic thesis is reflecting in the global equity markets, with India's Sensex index trading last quarter at the highest in a decade versus the S&P 500. So relative to other emerging markets, the Indian stocks have never been higher. People are actually looking at which other place over the next decade is actually going to be a great place to put the capital. Mr. Nilekani said, "I haven't seen this kind of interest in India for the last 15 years. Of course, Modi ji's manufacturing aspirations are not new. His Make in India campaign kicked off in 2014, seeking to emulate China and the tigers of East Asia from Singapore to South Korea and Taiwan that climbed into the ranks of rich economics by filling the factories with workers, making the exports the world wanted to buy. Boosting manufacturing to 25% of the GDP, a key metric for the program, has actually proven elusive. The ratio basically rose to 17.4% in 2020 compared with 15.3% in 2000, according to the data from McKinsey. Vietnamese factory sector more than doubled its share of GDP during the same period. But as this year's president of the group of 20 nations, India has actually the great momentum for this upcoming G20 summit. An external strategy actually built on multiple alliances and unapologetic self-interest has seen the nation boost purchases of Russian oil by 33 times, ignoring pressure from the Washington district. There are even some signs of pragmatism when it basically comes to the tense relationship with neighboring China. More than a dozen of Apple's Chinese suppliers are receiving initial clearance from New Delhi to expand operations, underpinning the tech giant's efforts to divert production to India. So, in a multipolar world, India's embrace of a middle path has actually bolstered its image as a nation. I repeat, in a multipolar world, India's embrace of a middle path has actually bolstered its image as a nation with which everyone across the globe is interested in having a good relationship with us, said Mr. Kenneth Juster, a former US ambassador to India. India is actually positioning itself and using its presidency of the G20 to do so as a bridge between East and West and North and South, he said. A lot of companies feel that given its size, given its young population, given its inevitable force in international affairs, India is actually a place where they should be. I repeat this statement as it is highlighting the core strengths being possessed by the Indian economy, which is helping it to get highlighted in the current scenario across the globe, and why it actually acts as the bright spot amidst the gloomy global economic scenario. I repeat this line. A lot of companies feel that given its size, given its young population that is a strong demographic dividend, and given its inevitable force in international affairs, India is actually a place where they should be. So, in an August speech commemorating 75 years since India's independence, that is Amrit Kaal, Modi ji urged the nation to settle for nothing less than to dominate the world. We must actually resolve to make India a developed nation in the next 25 years, he said at the Red Fort in New Delhi, occasionally swatting the air with clenched fists. Helicopters basically showered the crowd with flower petals before he spoke. Bloomberg Economics expects the nation's per capita income to pull even with some developed countries in that span, putting Modi ji's goal within reach. The potential GDP growth will gradually peak at about 8.5% early next decade, propelled by the corporate tax cuts, incentives for the manufacturers, and privatization of the public assets, according to BE. Moreover, the Center for Economics and Business Research predicts that India can become a $10 trillion economy by 2035. Now let's discuss the aspect of battling bureaucracy in this particular regard. Now, in order to meet his target, Modi ji will have to overcome the legacy of India's early years as an independent nation, which included decades of squandered economic opportunity. After Britain's partition of the subcontinent in 1947 and the religious violence that followed, India turned inward by the 1970s much of the economy was nationalized and a formidable bureaucracy was shut out from the world. So liberating system called the license Raj dictated everything from car models to what types of bread were allowed in the stores. In 1991, a balance of payments crisis, that is the BOP crisis, forced the change. Facing plunging foreign exchange reserves and pressure from the IMF, that is International Monetary Fund, then Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh basically endorsed and he insisted on devaluing the rupee and opening up to foreign investment. The reforms were actually a hard sell, but by the end of the decade, the changes to India's economic landscape were undeniable. GDP close to doubled, and the international brands from McDonald's to Microsoft offered new choices. In the 2000s, India notched several years of growth near 8%. So, when Modi ji rose to power in the year 2014, campaigning on minimum government and maximum governance. I repeat, minimum government and maximum governance. The voters saw an opportunity to actually build on liberalization, helping the Ronald Reagan on a white horse, as a prominent economist put it. India's new Prime Minister, the son of a tea seller, promised to clear the remaining cobwebs from the license Raj, including a culture of paying tribes for the essence to public services. And Modi ji styled himself as a political outsider with the managerial panache, poised to apply his experience running Gujarat, one of the nation's most industrialized states, to propel India towards top-down development. Now, he can claim significant progress, especially on infrastructure. Since Modi ji's election was in 2014, India's national highway network grew more than 50% longer. Domestic air passengers roughly doubled, and a vast biometric systems will basically help several 100 million people open bank accounts for the first time. So, among Modi ji and his Bharatiya Janata Party's most heralded achievements has been forging a single economic zone from India's overlapping federal and state taxes, perhaps the most consequential measure since 1991. The tax revenue collection hit a high last year, jumping 34% from the previous year. The government will actually lay out its budget for the next fiscal year on February 1. Streamlining India's economy has actually brought a lot more transparency in the system. And this statement was made by Mr. Adar Poonawalla, the Chief Executive of the Serum Institute of India, one of the world's largest vaccine manufacturers. And look at the collection now. The government is actually getting double or triple what they were getting in the previous regime. And the basic reception was quite chillier for Modi ji's 2016 ban on nearly all local currency banknotes to actually fight corruption and tax avoidance. The shock announcement has actually devastated Indians working for cash daily wages, and Modi ji struck another speed bump when he actually took his liberalization campaign to the agricultural sector, while makes up about a fifth of the economy. Sweeping reforms were abundant in 2021 after mass protests of nearly thousands saw that the farmers camping on the outskirts of the capital for months. Mr. Gurcharan Das, an author and former chief executive of Procter and Gamble India, said Modi ji still has much to pave if he wants to transform India in the big way that Margaret Thatcher revolutionized Britain. Part of the challenge is that Indian voters, many of whom still live on less than a few dollars a day, basically gravitate to the tangible political pledges like free electricity rather than abstract policies to spur the investment. In India, nobody, mind my words, nobody has told and has sold the reforms so the people believe they will make the rich richer and the poor poorer. Mr. Das said. But Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, an economic advisor to Modi ji's administration, projected confidence characterizing these issues as leading towards that would actually afflict any young nation. Boosting supply side productivity, enabling creative destruction, and continuing to reduce absolute poverty are among India's objectives for the past 25 years, he said. So, we are finally getting rid of the bureaucratic shackles in our heads, said Mr. Sanyal. Now, talking on the very main aspect of rising inequality in the global economy. Actually, India's population stood at 1.417 billion at the end of the last year, according to the estimates from the World Population Review. About 5 million more than China has reported. The United Nations expects India to actually reach the milestone later after this year. Half of India's people are under the age of 30, while China's citizens are actually aging rapidly, and so its population shrank in 2022 for the first time since the final year of the Great Famine in the 1960s. Among other notable differences, India's middle class actually remains significantly smaller, fully capturing the nation's demographic dividend, perhaps to its biggest advantage compared to bigger economies, will actually require broader wealth creation that results high employment among women, minorities, and young people. So, if we do not take care of inequality, we can't get very far with the growth, said Ms. Duvuri Subbarao, a former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. Nowhere else in the super wealthy growing faster than India. Drawing comparisons to the body and the heady times of America's Gilded Age. Since 1995, the wealth gap between the top 1% and bottom 50% has soared about 3 times more than the equivalent metric for the United States of America. And the new class of entrepreneurs is actually creating more unicorns. Unlisted companies worth at least $1 billion than any other nation apart from US and China. Their growing success is actually propelling the property rises in Mumbai and Bangalore hotspots, while encouraging from UBS Group AG to Deutsche Bank AG to hire more private bankers. Yet, by one estimate, the female labor force participation fell to 9% by 2022, in a part because of the pandemic. So closing the gap between men and women nearly 58 percentage points, and that could actually expand India's GDP by more than 30% by 2050. an analysis from the Bloomberg Economics found. So, India's large Muslim minority is also underrepresented. Despite forming 14% of the population, they are actually estimated to hold about 7% of the public sector jobs. The government critics fear that India's spectacular secular foundation and the economic potential of some 300 million people among its religious minorities are being underpinned by the hardline officials who have pushed for India to formally recast itself as a Hindu nation. Modi ji basically worked for years in a Hindu right organization before running for the public office. And a whole section of our people live more and more in a kind of continuous insecurity, said Mr. Harsh Mander, a social activist and leader and the founder of the Center for Equity Shares, a research organization in New Delhi. So this dynamic, he said, will be willing for secure environment. Now, what are the various factory dreams? Mr. Sunyal, the economic advisor to the Modi ji's government's administration, said the government is actually working to create opportunities for all Indians, and it's actually unfair to hold one leader responsible for the long-running challenges. India's manufacturing, which is actually raising to a quarter of GDP, and the jobs bounty that would actually come along with it, remains a top priority. While India's contribution to global trade is less than 2%, merchandise exports exceeded a record $400 billion last fiscal year, that's in 2022. So to compete with China, the government is actually providing more than $24 billion incentives over the next few years in more than a dozen industries. Some of the money will actually support the production of mobile phones handsets by the Westrock Corp and Samsung Electronics Company, the semiconductors by Honorable Rice Precision Industry Company, and the solar panels by Reliance Industries Limited. So in the coming months, the program will be extended to limited, and in the coming months of the program will be extended to the manufacturers of electrolyzers and other equipment needed to make green hydrogen. The next step is actually boosting the production beyond the world's manufacturing behemoths. Mr. Shiv Bhargava, the founder of Viraj Exports, a mid-sized garment exporter, said building scale in India can be difficult. At this factory in the industrial city of Noida, Mr. Bhargav weaved between the swing stations where the workers stitched the clothing bound for Zara. He has about 1,000 staff in the country, but has been saying that he had more of it weren't for the relatively restrictive labor laws. Modi ji has sought to streamline the rules, speaking fierce opposition from the state governments. Now, if we draw the comparative analysis with Bangladesh, our costs are 40% to 50% higher, Mr. Bhargav said. So when the economy of a country actually goes up, the labor has the option to have better options. Some younger Indians aspiring to the white-collar work are deferring employment rather than laboring in the factory. About half of potential workers under the age of 30 are not even looking for the jobs. The numbers are also explained by the changing employment patterns, especially in the rural areas, home to much of India's population. In Haryana, a key farming state, the evaporation of agricultural jobs has forced the workers to migrate from towns to the urban centers. So, perched on a rope caught, Miss Kusum, a young woman who lost a teaching position during the pandemic, said liberalization has actually benefited the village of Mundakera. Her family can now afford a washing machine and a motorcycle. Every morning she uses her smartphone to scan the Google for employment opportunities and catch up on the current events. But as farming declines, she said, India has to move faster to equip her generation with marketable skills in a more globalized economy. The quality jobs are now scarer. They are now scarer in the Mundakera district, where the tidy brick homes surround a pond speckled with algae. Our education is not skill based, and the private sector needs that, she said. So, if we build India's future, what are the key requirements? Even with these obstacles, optimism pervades India's business elite. The entrepreneurs are basically eager to capitalize on a stronger tolerance for risk taking, where higher consumption spending and a vibrant ecosystem for the digital startups. In Mumbai, the airy headquarters of Nykaa is abuzz as young employees film content with makeup kits. The business, India's top e-commerce site for the beauty products, has a fervent following among the Bollywood stars and much more than 100 brick and mortar stores. Then Miss Falguni Nair, a foreign banker who started Nykaa with her daughter in the year 2012, said India has actually cleared the banana skins that the entrepreneurs used to slip on. The industry benefited from the changes like the easing of taxes on premium products, she said. In 2021, Nykaa raised 53.5 billion rupees, that is about $660 million, in a stellar integral public offering, helping to make Nair the country's richest self-made woman. So before we know it, we will be the third largest economy in the world, she said. Nair's often asked if the consumption is actually stronger in cities than in rural areas, to which she replies, not anymore. In many towns, if earlier we used to see the fans, now they will have the air conditioners and refrigerators. Modi ji's popularity remains robust, giving him a platform to enact change that may actually lead to the envy by many world leaders. Polls considerably peg the Prime Minister's approval rating above 70%. This month, Modi ji urged the members of his ruling party to reach out to the Muslims and other religious minorities, which is actually a rare move to tone down the sectarian tensions as he prepares to host the G20 summit. So with national elections due in 2024, the question on the horizon is actually the extent to which the economic ambition will shape the Modi ji's agenda and how he expends his political capital. So we are actually optimistic, said Mr. Adar Poonawalla, the chief economist executive of the Serum Institute of India. So despite the disruption in the global supply chains and oil prices and inflation and a war crisis, India fundamentally is actually doing very well. Now, my dear friends, we are going to discuss the viewpoints by JLL, who basically states that the long-term growth story of Indian economy remains intact. Actually, the long-term growth story of the Indian economy remains intact, helping attract institutional investments despite the global headwinds, said Mr. Richard Bloxham, member of JLL's Global Executive Board and CEO Capital Markets. So, India emerged as the world's fifth largest economy last year, overtaking the United Kingdom, and it is set to surpass Japan and Germany to become the third largest economy by 2029. So, India is actually one of the few large economies not facing any significant political or economic threats until now. The International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, has projected 6.8% growth for the year 2022 and nearly 6.1% in the year 2023. The highest for any large economy in the current times. This makes India the fastest growing economy in the world, Mr. Bloxham told Economic Times. So, while rising inflation and the associated rate increases, according to him, remains a cause of concern, the long-term India growth and investment story actually remains intact. Regardless of the short-term headwinds, India remains a resilient and attractive destination for the foreign capital, including the country's property industry. The central banks across the world have actually responded to rising inflation with interest rate hikes, and India is actually no exception, he said. But despite a slew of challenges, including global headwinds, the growth story of India remains a bright spot. The institutional investors have continued to pour money into the Indian real estate sector. More than $5.1 billion or 38,480 crore rupees of investments in 47 deals were made in 2022. JLL India data showed it. In aggregate terms, that amounted to nearly 20% growth. India continues to be a growing focus for international capital, and the real estate markets continue to be more transparent and more mature. So these factors bode well for the international investments, Mr. Bloxham said. So institutionalization of India's real estate is actually expected to pick up pace. Frequency is to be maintained. Frequency basically needs to be maintained, paying a lot of emphasis on transparency, which is basically expected to increase from here on. And this aspect will attract a larger share of global investments in the years to come. The long-term growth perception towards India is unlikely to wane anytime soon, he added. In the real estate, the commercial offices continue to be the preferred investment segment in India. In addition to this, warehousing and data centers will also attract a major share of institutional investments. Warehousing has been attracting a lot of investment in the recent years. The pandemic was a catalyst for growth when the usage of warehousing facilities by e-commerce platforms rose sharply. The warehousing industry has actually emerged as a resilient asset class and continues to show an upward trend within the real estate sector. There is actually an increased interest from institutional investors in this regard, which is making the demand for the quality grade A properties, Mr. Bloxham said. So after this great, insightful and in-depth analysis, paying a lot of emphasis towards the long-term growth story of India, which is actually expected to remain intact, I would like to move forward to actually go through the insights being presented by our Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji, who basically propagates the adoption of new technology in order to strengthen traditional policing. Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji on Sunday said the police forces should actually be made more sensitive and trained in emerging technologies. He was addressing the All India Conference of Director Generals and Inspectors General of Police. He also emphasized on the importance of National Data Governance Framework for facilitating smooth data exchange across the agencies. So while we would further leverage the technological solutions like the biometrics, etc., there is also a need to further strengthen the traditional policing mechanisms like the food patrols. Our PM has recommended repealing obsolete criminal laws and building the standards for police organizations across the states, said the statement issued after the conference. Moreover, the PM also suggested prison reforms as well as strengthening of border and coastal security by the organization of the frequent visits of the officials. The police chiefs discussed more than a dozen security challenges at a three-day conference in the national capital, including mass agitations such as those over the Agnipath scheme. The 2019 protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens. Then the farmer protests and Bhim Koregaon agitations and online mobilization through these protests. The challenges posed by cryptocurrencies, implementation of 5G, then unfenced borders, overstaying foreigners, radical groups, and managing the Chinese influence in businesses include Chinese loan apps, and these were discussed in detail as per the officials. The use of the social media by the protesters was identified as one of the major challenges being faced by the law enforcement agencies, with influencers using the hashtags and making them a trend. It was suggested that artificial intelligence be used for face recognition and the drones be deployed to identify those who are making mistakes during the peaceful protests. Moreover, a 24/7 social media lab where the trained policemen can monitor the social media was actually said to be the need of the hour, along with the dialogue with the protesters, regular media interaction, and official presence of the authorities on social media to actually allay any apprehension or the fake talks. A person privy to the domestic discussions said on the condition of anonymity. The participants said that the basic infiltration into such protests by the policemen can actually help authorities plan the negotiations. The apprehension was basically expressed regarding the similar protests by the vested groups to stall India's growth in the run-up to the 2024 general elections, as per the officials' report. Now, my dear friends, I'm going to discuss a very, very important aspect related to counter-terrorism, trade, and inclusive connectivity, which was discussed at India's SCO, that is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and our team should justify the agenda of the top SCOs of India. India's presidency of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has actually picked up the momentum, with the central government hosting several events in January to give shape to both hard and soft power agenda, with an eye to balance China's inroads across Eurasia. So, countering terrorism, widening inclusive connectivity initiatives in Eurasia, stabilizing Afghanistan, and pushing the trade in Central Asia, Eurasia, top India's agenda, according to the persons familiar with the matter. In this particular backdrop, 4 senior officials meetings, then the National Coordinators meeting, and the SCO Film Festival are scheduled to take place this month. The senior officials and the national coordinators have met in Varanasi, which has been designated as the first ever tourist and cultural capital of SCO for 2022-23. So, at the forthcoming Surajkund Mela, the SCO, that is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is actually a partner organization. India is also hosting the foreign and defense ministers meetings, besides national security advisor level meetings of the grouping, with the summit planned here in the middle of this year ahead of the G20 summit. SCO is a key platform for the Indian subcontinent's outreach to Central Asia. India is actually keen that SCO contributes to actually counter the growing radical views and extremism in Eurasia, including Central Asia, which has direct bearing on the country's strategic interests as a Eurasian power. Besides, there has been considerable focus on the optimum use of Chabur Port and the international north-south transport corridor as viable and inclusive connectivity initiatives parallel to the China's Belt and Road Initiative in the region. India actually wants to connect Chabur, that is Chabahar Port, with the INSTC, which has over the last 1 year pushed Indo-Russian trade to an unprecedented level. So, dear friends, we basically analyze that this is really a very, very critical time which is going on, wherein we need to boost on certain sectors as discussed in the current in the current session, in order to boost globalization aspect, hence benefiting own country and also benefiting various economies across the globe with whom we are engaging in actually enhancing the bilateral ties at a strategic level. Moreover, dear friends, we have also discussed in detail various aspects related to Gandhiji's seven sins, that is, how to conduct ethical globalization. Yes, I'm using the term ethical globalization, which is actually commerce without morality, politics without principle, and knowledge without character. These are the very important sins, very significant sins, which are actually accounted as the three most relevant sins being committed in the process of globalization. Hence, we should incorporate ethical. Hence, we should incorporate ethical aspects in the overall process of globalization. Hence, making it ethical globalization with the help of commerce with morality, politics with principles, and knowledge with character. Moreover, we have also discussed in detail the strategic significance of the digital economy and why the leaders across the globe are giving it a push in order to offer hope for multiple players functioning across various domains. Then, my dear friends, we have analyzed in detail the relationship India is exchanging with France in terms of the defense sector. And these bilateral strategic ties are actually of immense importance because as of now, India is extremely dependent on Russia with regard to this particular sector, that is defense. So, being associated with France would help India to diversify from Russia. Though India's defense and security establishment argues that as New Delhi seeks to move away from its dependence on Russia, it will also keep the interests of Russia, which has for long been the biggest partner for India in its strategic program. Then we have discussed about easing of various norms for certain sectors which needs to be incorporated by the government under the Export Promotion Capital Goods Scheme, that is the EPCG scheme. And this relaxation has basically been provided in light of the economic slowdown caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this relief will actually help the hotel, healthcare, and educational sectors to cope with the negative impact of the pandemic on their export activities. Moreover, my dear friends, we have analyzed in a very broad manner that how India is actually stepping up in order to fulfill the needs of global economy by becoming a new powerhouse. And it is of extreme importance. It is of really extreme importance, as we have seen that our respected Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji wants to make India a developed nation very soon, that is within next 25 years. And how soon can a country once synonymous with red tape become a $10 trillion economy is a big puzzle which our government is solving very, very beautifully. And that's why we are being praised on the international forum and are being highlighted as the brightest spot among amidst the gloomy global economic environment. Furthermore, we have also discussed the long-term growth story of the Indian economy and how to keep it intact. That is, the long-term growth story of the Indian economy remains intact, helping attract the institutional investments despite the global headwinds, said Mr. Richard Bloxham, member of JLL's Global Executive Board and CEO, Capital Markets. Furthermore, my dear friends, we have also discussed how does the adoption of new technology help to strengthen the traditional policing. The Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji on Sunday said the police forces should actually be made more and more sensitive and trained in emerging technologies, as it is the era of technology, the modern technology. So we need to incorporate technology in each and every domain possible in order to enhance our prospects for favorable development. He was actually addressing the All India Conference of Director Generals and Inspectors General of Police. Moreover, we have also discussed in detail that how does counter-terrorism, trade, inclusive connectivity is actually the top India's SCO agenda. India's presidency of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has actually picked up momentum, with the central government hosting several events in January to give shape to both hard and soft power agenda with an eye to balance China's inroads across Eurasia. So, my dear friends, this session has been of extreme relevance as we have tried to analyze in great detail to broaden our overall understanding in these strategic aspects. And I hope you would have found this session very, very relevant and insightful, helping you to develop a very comprehensive understanding of how to effectively operate in the current scenario. And you would also be able to understand what are the key ingredients of success in order to be declared as the successful leader in a very, very beautiful manner. And we have also realized, as we have been realizing in all our sessions, that we are being led under the very, very well formed and very well devised decisions, the far-sighted decisions of our charismatic leaders. And this is the moment of great pride. This is the moment of great pride. So, on this note, I would like to conclude my today's session. Thank you so much. Namaskar. Jai Hind.